innovation push. And in this program and the series, we are looking into how innovation can help insurance industry players within the insurance industry to better create value-added products, value-added processes, and also to look into what the industry area is going towards. And today it's actually about cybersecurity, and I think this is in everyone's mind. And we're talking more details in a few minutes with it. Briefly on YellowMay. So we are an insurance innovation-driven consultancy agency, and basically look at all different aspects of insurance industry, and that's one of the reasons why we basically look at all product areas in overall. But now I have a pleasure to introduce, and she will share more details from herself. Kirsten, go ahead and show a few words of yourself, and then also some words from your company. Go ahead. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Kirsten Bay, co-founder and CEO of Cysurance. My background in terms of bringing the insurance conversation into it is I came from a financial and risk management background before I joined into the cybersecurity world about 16 years ago. And in that time, I saw this distinct difference between traditional risk management and technology integrations into the enterprise environment. So I always felt like there was this opportunity to marry those 2 points together more effectively to more effectively understand how to invest in cyber protection, as well as how to manage the overall risk for an organization better. So when I started thinking about this insurance question, I felt like the financial side of insurance can be a really interesting push to get organizations to look differently at cyber risk management, particularly. And as we enter into this very hard market for cyber insurance, particularly, what we're seeing is that financial driver is really changing the dynamic of how people are investing in their cyber protections. And it really helps us understand better that sort of residual risk component. How much do we want to put in residual risk? How much do we invest? And now that cyber insurance is becoming so much more expensive, it's making organizations realize that getting the right controls in place is actually starting to lower the cost of their purchasing insurance as well. So that financial dynamic is one of the interesting components of what we're seeing today in our environment.
Well, I think definitely the interesting part in a way, last episode we were talking of reinsurance, which is kind of global. But basically, if you look at cyber in from the aspect that why insurances are they so different from country to country, or aren't they? I think in a cyber, you don't even, I think, well, you can open up it as well, but from our aspect, that who is then kind of the company buys the insurance from one country, but it spreads all around here in the online world. But why insurances, are they different?
Well, in a top line level, they're not hugely different when it comes to what people expect from a cyber insurance policy. What's interesting in country by country there are a couple of things. One is the licensing. So, in the United States, things that we're allowed to do in insurance in the United States are actually quite different from a licensing perspective in the UK, EU, like what we call the FCA rule group, the sort of common law rule group there, but they're not vastly different. When you get down to things like if you're allowed to pay for ransom or pay for regulatory fines, those are where some of the big differences occur. The biggest differences are in Asia. And so, like, for example, in covering a ransomware event, there are certain jurisdictions where you're not allowed to pay a ransom at all because it's an illegal act, and so therefore you can't pay for an illegal act. So those are some of the things that become very nuanced, and I will say that we definitely have representation by legal counsel in most of the jurisdictions to figure out what's allowed, what can we put in the form, how do we standardize the form as much as possible. So there are interesting components to try and bring those things together. So for larger organizations who want to have complete coverage across the world, it can be a little bit thorny at times just because you do get some of those unique use cases that make it difficult to standardize completely.
Okay, that is, and if looking at then, for example, from the aspect of that, you buy an insurance within US or you buy it in Europe or in Asia, the persons who are then misusing kind of all that you have the cover for someone, you have no idea where they are from. So how does it go there? So if yes, you buy the policy in US, but the perpetrator or the company comes from, I'm not pointing out names, but comes from Africa or it comes from Asia, and they have completely different jurisdiction there and completely different legislation. How do you see, how is it easy to help these people, or is it very difficult to help these people in these situations?
Well, the nice thing is, like, for example, if you were to have a US based company, but you have subsidiaries or other organizations in different parts of the world, then you can take that coverage and apply it to wherever those organizations are, and you can support them pretty effectively. The challenge becomes more on the legal side, where we see people being attacked from these different countries, and whether there's an ability to have any legal recourse where there's a criminal capability where you can actually prosecute them, recover funds, those types of things. That's really where it's just completely almost not discussed. It's like, how do we even figure out how to prosecute? Now, we're starting to see more and more cooperation by other countries to allow us to prosecute, because I think that's one of the big challenges in cyber, particularly to your point, is that jurisdictional issue, and if there's any ability to recover. And so that becomes where the market becomes very tight. How do we actually set coverage? How do we pay for it when we know that there's no possibility of recovery from a criminal perspective? I read a lot about the litigations around insurance, and you see them broadly, from malpractice or property, and there's always the subrogation right, and really in cyber, the subrogation is between company to company, not to individuals, because it is this unknown, right? It's the unknown criminal in many examples.
Yeah, because what is kind of there, you crash with a car, then the other side of is there. But when someone crashes you in the aspect of online world, you have no idea where you are basically then in the sense of of this situation. And I think, do you see also this, because obviously from the competitors as well, and if you're your local US based company, but you are there really, as you said, that it's very probably difficult to get assistance to other places in the world, because you basically are based in one country, but your product completely goes into a different direction of being global.
Yes, and that's, there are a lot of like remediation firms who can support globally in those instances, but not all of them. And there's a jurisdictional challenge with data, as an example. And so, like with GDPR, or even like the privacy laws in Germany, that's one of the areas where one has to be the most aware of the different jurisdictional challenges, where can you export data when you're taking data around customers and understanding their network environments. We have to house that specifically in one place. So one has to be very careful about the privacy and data management, even with the customers who are enrolled in these programs. And then if you're going through a remediation from an attack, and you have someone who's in a jurisdiction where there are very strict privacy laws, one has to be very careful not to destroy evidence, but where do you store that evidence? It's difficult to be a remote remediation team, because you have to be able to extract that data and bring it back into country. So these are things where we try to use partners who are established locally, who can help support remediation, and that way we know that none of those other privacy or jurisdictional issues will come into play.
Well, then kind of like, obviously, if looking at in broad scale, kind of what kind of a role do you see in the future? What cyber plays in this insurance product world? How do you see what direction this is evolving?
Well, it's interesting because cyber insurance has become such a topic, right? But interestingly, I will go to places and have conversations with people, and they'll ask what I do, and I'll say we work in cyber insurance, and people are like, "What's cyber insurance?" I'm like, "How do you not know what cyber insurance is?" So it isn't as well known. We talk about it all the time in our insurance world, but outside the insurance world, there are a lot of, especially small businesses that don't even know that type of thing exists. Yet more and more and more, every size organization has a footprint on the internet, right? The first thing we do is look at our phones when we get up in the morning, right? So we are connected all the time. And so I think when I talk about it a lot, I talk about how it's like general liability insurance for your digital footprint. And your company has to be able to function, and you need the same level of protections. And the other thing about cyber insurance is it's not just about what I call bad guy protection, where there are malicious things that happen to you. It's also disaster recovery type protections, where if there are infrastructure failures, power outages, your credit card reader doesn't work, things like this, that if you have an outage over an 8-hour period of time, you can get financial recovery for lost revenue, right? So there's the operational component of it, and then the criminal component of it, lost data, accidental deletion, your server blows up with all of your information on it. All of those things are covered as well. And so it's as important coverage as one might have as you're in a building and you're protecting the building itself, because it's the whole engine of what drives companies now, and that's what we really need to think about going forward.
Well, and then if you look at it from kind of, and it always comes down to the risk awareness as well from end users. Do you see there are, and I know that people are a bit more aware of, obviously, that because everything is online, even though of talking of metaverse and looking at really being digital in, for example, in the workplaces in the future, someone can basically, I would say that someone can impersonate you as being a person in reality. Now this is a bit more difficult when being kind of in an analog world, but in the future, this can, while you do this already, you could do this over the screen. But how you would build this risk awareness? What would be there? What would you actually say in those situations to an end user that, okay, well, basically it's kind of a driving license to be online?
Yes. Well, and I do think the car analogy is a good one. I always say that the basic proper controls that one should have in place, whether you're in a corporate environment or in a personal environment, having endpoint protection, a VPN, a virtual private network, where when you're out in the world, your data is quiet. I think one of the biggest challenges individually is that individuals really feel like broadly, they don't have a lot that people want to take from them. And so it's difficult to understand how someone could leverage you as an individual. People who've had their identity stolen will tell you it's the most horrible experience, because you really do feel disoriented in a way, because you realize that someone out there is trying to be you, and they're trying to buy cars and houses, and yet you're financially responsible. But I think what's interesting is that we have on the personal side this messaging that comes from credit card companies and others who are like, oh, don't worry, if something bad happens, we'll make you whole. It's not a problem. It's difficult to take that mindset and go, well, if someone uses my credit card, I'll get my money back. It's not an issue. But then you go into your corporate environment and they're told everything has to be locked down. You must be careful. Bad people are trying to hurt us. And so I think there's this dissonance right now between the personal message and the corporate message that we need to figure out how to integrate, because we as individuals are attack vectors, whether we're in the office or talking on Zoom or whatever we're doing, it's still one and the same.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it is kind of looking into the role of who is kind of responsible in the essence. I was having an interesting discussion earlier last week of that if you're in a mall and someone hijacks the mall from an online system, kind of, yes, the shopping mall is responsible to get you out, but this could be a reality. and then being done. So I think it's very relevant to kind of really figure out that the more everything is connected, it really means that it is connected.
Yes.
And I think this is definitely the topic. If you look at kind of like, but then if you look at it from large scale, let's say reinsurers or big insurance companies, the cost of cyber, both the premiums, because this is obviously driven by the claims cost. What would you see there? What are the options there to kind of ease up the overall kind of, well, introducing a new insurance area is obviously one thing, but also kind of to support in a way that it makes sense to because now I know that there are situations where basically companies are saying that, well, no, we don't offer this. And that's kind of like, then from the governmental point of view, there would be government saying that, okay, they are saying you have to have this traffic insurance, for example, you have to have it. Do you see what is the discussion? You probably know it, at least from the US perspective, that who kind of drives this development there?
Well, interestingly, the primary driver of adoption of cyber insurance is coming from the vendor community. So you have, if you are a vendor of a large corporation, those are where we're seeing the most stringent mandates. So, you know, I sell goods to you and you say, you know, the only way, because so many of our networks, to your point earlier, we're all connected to each other. So in order for you to be able to connect to our network, like Target has this rule, you have to have a cyber insurance policy, and we're actually going to audit your environment so that if we see that you have vulnerabilities or you haven't patched systems or something like that in your environment, they actually sever API connections to your organization, which makes it very difficult to push bills of lading, automatic ordering systems. And so the large vendors are starting, or the large, like especially in the supply chain world, the big players are forcing down on the smaller players so that they can help protect their own environments. And so it's interesting in the United States, the legislative body in terms of really enforcing adoption of those types of products usually comes from the private sector. And like around the car analogy, I did a lot of research around how long it took for the seatbelt to become a mandate, and it was 10 years. And so the 3-point harness seatbelt was introduced in the late 70s, and then it started to percolate through the system, you know, and people started collecting all that data, and then they realized how effective that seatbelt was. And then New York was the first state that implemented the seatbelt law, and then everyone followed suit. Airbags, although not a law, are essentially now a mandate, but that's driven by insurance companies and insurance. So the private sector is saying, look, we're going to continue to offer discounts and we're going to offer these capabilities because we see that safety is getting so much better and we want to mitigate our risk and keep you healthy. It's the same thing that we're trying to do in cyber, is how do we enforce those controls? And that's been the big shift, is that people said, oh yeah, I do all these things. And then when they had an actual incident, it was like, oh, it turned out you didn't do any of those things, but they still covered the policies. That's not happening anymore. So I call it the cyber seatbelt effect, right? We're now really forcing that cyber seatbelt, but that will still come from the private sector, I think, for a long time.
Good. Well, yeah, I see this, but in the essence of I think some form of governmental aspect will be there, due to the fact that obviously, yes, they're kind of the competitive products, they don't want to intermediate in these, but if looking at as an example, and I think this is very complicated, if looking at, I know that there is I read an article from, I think it was from Swiss Re, and they were saying that kind of like now a lot of the policies are actually excluding war, for example. Well, I think generally, if you talk of war currently, almost everyone knows which war it is, but kind of like then, but in the end of the day, if you look at, there's always wars have been there in the world. And then if you exclude saying that, okay, well, this cybersecurity product is not valid if it's a war situation, it's kind of like, I don't know, is it kind of valid in a way to say this? That's kind of like, and how how would you start to separate it? Kind of like, as I understand that there needs to be separation within how to do this, how to kind of say that, okay, this incident would have happened regardless of, or it's not driven by kind of an, let's say, it's called as being the force majeure in that sense. But can there be even in cyber a force majeure?
Well, this is a question that a lot of governments are asking, and I participated in a government working group to discuss this issue. I worked on the threat intelligence side for a number of years, and so the point that I brought up in this particular instance is it's very difficult to attribute intent. And why I say attribute intent is we very often can find the actor who was the perpetrator of the event, but on what basis were they perpetrating the event? Because we have many countries where the same actors act for themselves as criminals, but they also act on behalf of the government. And at what point can you say, oh, well, today Joe was acting on behalf of the government and he wasn't acting on behalf of himself or his criminal gang, right? And that's, I think, the big challenge. I think we need to look at them more as systemic issues. And the interesting point of that question is the NotPetya event was really what started this change into the hard market that we have in cyber insurance. That was sort of the beginning of where things really became much more aware. But we also have seen that Mondelez and Merck had lawsuits that were pending since 2017 that were settled this year. So Mondelez was just settled in the last couple of weeks. Both organizations were given coverage by the courts. So we'll continue to not know the answer to this question because it is just so challenging. And so one of the questions is, well, if you weren't the direct entity, like we weren't directly attacking you, but you were downstream affected. So there are some questions about whether those people can have coverage because they weren't the target themselves. So I think the answer is to be continued.
I know, because kind of like, I think, and one of the challenges is obviously there that, because an incident can be anything between kind of let's say a few thousands of dollars or euros in basically helping in the incident to recover something, or then it can be 500 millions in a ransomware, basically, that if there's a lot of the personal data being, and I think that's very challenging. You don't see this in any, I would say almost any other insurance area or an insurance product, that this could be the scope, that yes, the claim can be 5,000 or it can be 500 million. Yeah. And kind of the same policy should cover it.
That's right. Well, and that's the thing, that what we're seeing now in the evolution of these ransom attacks is that the extortion issue is really the greatest issue that we're all facing from the data perspective. And that when we're seeing claims, it's the ransom itself is small in comparison to how much it's costing to do the forensic evaluation and then figure out all the notification requirements. And so you have these massive recovery costs, and that's really what's driving the cost. And people are so they're sort of fixated on the cost of the ransom because that's what's published in the newspaper. But what they don't understand, to your point, is, like, let's say it's a big one, like it's a $5 million ransom or $10 million ransom. What people don't understand is that it's probably another 30, 40, 50, like Merck, for example, theirs was $1 billion. So they filed the claim for 850 million, and the court actually awarded them 1.3 billion. And that's how much it cost them to recover from that event. So, I mean, it's just mind-blowing how much it can be.
Yeah, exactly. But then I think this question is interesting in from the sense that this is basically a new product feature area and a new product segment in overall. But how innovative are cyber insurance generally? This kind of like looking at it from the aspect that kind of cyber has been there as long as online world has been there. But how much has been real, what would you say, real development?
I think we're just at the very, very beginning. I mean, it just in these last 4.5 years that I've been involved in this business, still the paper form was floating around. We just kind of have gotten away from paper forms, like you could just fill in your application online. I think the real innovation is coming in our ability to really assess risk beyond the paper form, and we're trying to figure out. And this is the broader problem in cyber, which is what we call indicators and indicators of compromise and incidents, and all of the noise that are in networks. And so, the what matters question in terms of the data is still one of the fundamental questions we're trying to figure out so that we can properly assess risk. But in order to get there, we have to go even further to the left, which is really, really ensuring that people are doing the things that they say they're doing, in that minimum controls perspective, verifying that, and then having that ongoing analysis, because the big complaint people have now is like they think that cyber insurance policies don't pay, but that's because there's this gap between the understanding of what I'm supposed to be doing in my environment and what the insurance company believes I should be doing, and there's like this disconnect. And so from the innovation perspective, it's creating alignment between the insurer and the insured. And so there are lots of data acquisition models and companies trying to provide services in addition. And the question is whether insurance companies should be service providers in addition to providing insurance. And I think that that's really where our real innovation will have to kind of break the mold of how we think traditionally about insurance to get us to the next phase.
Okay, thank you. Then let's see, we'll need to ask from Kirsten, do you have any questions there? But then if you would say, you said that it's the beginning, how innovative on a scale 1 to 10, what would you say?
Maybe we're a 2 because we've stopped filling out paper applications. Because I think this is, as I said, it's one of the most nascent parts of insurance in terms of the category. It's also interesting, the fastest growing category of insurance in the history of insurance. So as innovation has a tendency to catch up with that movement, but I do think we're very immature in terms of where our innovation is, and so we have a long way to go. But there's that 2 to 10 portion is going to be an interesting journey.
Just a brief note then, if anyone has a question there, I think we have time for one question then. Let's see, is there any? I have one if we don't.
There's nothing in the chat.
Audience. Okay.
Oh, here, well, there's one question.
Okay, so well, I can read this one.
You can read it, okay.
So do you think there's a right level of awareness around cybersecurity for companies? Are there verticals that are but are they okay? But I think this is an interesting. We touched on it, but are there verticals which are understanding it more?
Yeah, I would say that financial services and healthcare certainly are at the front end. Financial services, particularly, and for the reasons that one might expect, that they have been attacked for a long time. And if you think about the bank robber was always the one innovating faster than the banks. And then the bank robber figured out it was getting too hard to rob a bank in the physical world, so they went and started robbing banks in the virtual world. And so the financial services sector has certainly been a tremendous leader. And where they've led the most, and where I think it's the most critical, is around identity and access management. Because if your credentials can't be exploited and you can't have what we refer to as escalation of privileges, meaning you take my credentials and then try to find the admin so that you can then get inside every important part of the network, that's where they've led in sort of segmentation of networks and really trying to help people become much more effective at creating moats, if you will, through the network, so that someone can't continually move across the network to exploit all of the assets.
Yeah. And as a final note on when moving into also to Web3 and to Metaverse, what do you expect to see there from cybersecurity insurance point of view?
Well, NFTs it's already starting to be a discussion point. In the metaverse, I've even had discussions with people that there'll be life insurance products and other types of those things. So I find that fascinating. But certainly, to your point earlier of that identity piece, I think personal cyber insurance is going to become something that's more prevalent as these worlds mesh together, because people will need to make sure that they have their own protections. And if their identity is stolen or they need support, cyberbullying, all these things, these are becoming much more of an insurable event even for individuals. And I think that we'll see a lot of growth there as well.
Yeah, and what comes to my mind that basically who are now moving into the online world is salespeople and these. So salespeople do have an insurance for cyber, because then in the future it will be your identity that will be stolen there. Definitely, I think this is there. Thank you for the chat. I saw there was a lot of discussion. Unfortunately, there were some issues of logging in, but the recording is there, so we can share it obviously afterwards. Then that will definitely, that we have not lost information. I think this was good. I think, yeah, definitely. I'd love the discussion, and I think this is the forum what we actually are contributing in the future as well, to have a dialogue and to share the views in a more informal way, definitely, than it's the, so that it's kind of a chat that we always have with different industry areas. So any final words comes to your mind?
No, I just really appreciate the opportunity to join you today, and we look forward to maybe we can have another chat in 6 months, and I'll tell you all the things that changed, because it's so rapidly evolving that we look forward to the continuing saga of what cyber insurance is.
Yeah, exactly. Excellent. Thank you, Kirsten.
Thank
you.
Such a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for the audience, and then we'll be in touch.